There was a taxi. That is the detail that will not leave me alone. Not the crime itself. I have read worse in court files, and so has anyone who has spent time in the Moscow prosecutor's offices these past few years. Not the investigation, which was clean and fast, the kind that clears itself. What stays with me is the taxi. 3 bags on a Saturday morning. A driver who asked no questions because he had been paid not to. Tushino is a district on the western edge of the city, where the river bends and the factories run, and the apartment blocks stand in rows like teeth. The bags went into the water. The driver took his fare and drove home. I got this story from a man named Kasatkin. Igor Kasatkin, investigator, Moscow City Prosecutor's Office, second floor office that smells of old paper, and something chemical that I later identified as the solvent used to clean the copying machine in the hall. I had come to see him for a different reason. I was trying to understand something about the way the criminal world and the world of street prostitution were beginning to overlap. Not overlap the way things overlap on a diagram, at the edges, but interpenetrate the way 2 substances mix when the membrane between them dissolves. The police called it alarming. The newspapers called it a social problem. Kasatkin put a case file on the desk and said, "Read this first, then tell me what question you want to ask." He gave me 40 minutes. I read quickly, and then I read it again. The crime was solved. The sentences were long. There was nothing mysterious in any of it, no unsolved detail, no fugitive. What the file contained was a shape, a recognizable geometry that I had seen before in smaller forms, in single incidents, in brief items at the bottom of page 4. Here it was assembled in full, with names and dates and the flat procedural language of the court record. I sat with it for a long time after Kasatkin came back into the office and offered me a cigarette. He said, "This is not unusual." I said, "I know." He said, "But you'll write about it anyway." I said I would try. He lit his own cigarette and watched the smoke for a moment before he went on. He told me that a few days after the arrests, he had gone to the apartment himself, not because it was procedurally necessary, but because he had wanted to see the room. The door was sealed. On the landing, the neighbors from the flat across had stopped him on his way out. They told him they had started to feel something in the air of the building. Not a smell. There was no smell. The apartment had been cleaned well enough. There was nothing physically wrong with the building, but something was there, they said, on the landing, in the stairwell, in the slow hours of the afternoon. They asked him whether it was safe to continue living on this floor. Kasatkin said he had told them the truth, which was that the building was as safe as any other building. He had not been able to tell them what they already understood, and did not want to say aloud, which was that what they were feeling was not in the air. It was in them. The apartment had been closed for days. What was leaking out of it was the knowledge of what had happened, and the knowledge was now housed in them, and they were trying to locate it somewhere outside themselves, because there it could be shut away, and here, in them, it could not. He said this the way he said everything, without emphasis, as a completed observation. He added, "This is also part of the cycle. First it happens, then people know. Then they construct a version of it they can live with, and the version becomes the thing they remember instead of what was there. The woman's name was Galina. I am not giving her last name, for reasons that will become clear, but that are, in any case, probably obvious already. She was from the Moscow suburbs, one of those towns on the outer ring where the factories run shifts and the commute to the city takes 2 hours each way, and the air in winter has a particular quality that people who grew up there learn not to think about. She had passed her entrance examinations, which were competitive, which means she was not careless or dull. She moved into a student dormitory and began the life that dormitories in this city afford. 4 people to a room in a building that smells permanently of boiled cabbage and institutional disinfectant, where the hot water appears on a schedule that the administration periodically revises without informing the residents, where the single communal telephone on each floor is occupied from 6 in the evening until the person using it can no longer think of anything else to say. She was 18 years old, and she had escaped. I want to be precise about what that means. She had escaped the factory smoke and the 2-hour commute and the life that was already laid out in front of her in the suburb, which was not a bad life, not a cruel one, but a specific and inflexible one, the life of a woman who married early and worked at the same enterprise and watched her children escape to the city someday as she had not. She had taken her examination scores and converted them into something else. This is a form of ambition. I do not use that word sarcastically. She made friends. That is how it begins, always. There are parties in someone's room, or someone's friend's room, or a kitchen commandeered after midnight, when the dormitory supervisor's light is out. Boys appear, then boys who know other boys who have access to things. Champagne is the word that appears in the testimony. And champagne in this context means not the domestic kind, the kind that costs what a skilled worker earns in a week, but something that came through other channels, through the networks of exchange that run underneath the official economy like a second circulatory system. There was a restaurant. There was more champagne. The boy paid. She understood the first time what the payment implied. She was very drunk. She told the investigator later, and I believe her, not because being drunk excuses what happened, but because it is simply true. And she said it without appearing to think it was exculpatory, which is itself a kind of honesty. She was not drunk the second time. Or the third, what develops over months, is a calculation. Not a decision. Decisions have a moment, a before and after. A calculation accretes, like sediment. If a man is paying for a dinner and a bottle of wine and a taxi home, the evening has a price, and that price is known to both parties, even when neither says it aloud. And there arrives a point when performing ignorance of the price becomes impossible, when pretending becomes work, when the work of pretending costs more than simply acknowledging what the arrangement is. I do not know what she thought about that calculation. Court documents do not contain that kind of information. What they contain is the external shape. She moved between circles of acquaintances when one grew stale. She met another young woman who had made a similar calculation. They rented a flat together, and the transaction became explicit. They took money from men, they shared the rent. The arrangement was theirs, not anyone else's, not managed by anyone else, not organized by anyone above them in any hierarchy. It was a practical solution to the specific problem of being young and female and short of money in Moscow in 1990. And I note, because it will matter in a moment, that it was substantially safer than most of the alternatives. Her friend moved out, eventually, or they had some disagreement, or circumstances changed. The file is not specific about this period. What the file is specific about is this: a week before the events I am going to describe, the landlord of their rented apartment told them they had 2 days to leave. He wanted the flat back. He did not explain why. He did not need to explain why. The landlord's right to reclaim a flat on short notice was one of those facts of Soviet life that people understood without requiring elaboration. 2 days, the friend was already somewhere else. Galina had not found a new flat, and there was no money for a hotel, and she had no family in the city, and the dormitory was no longer available to her because she was no longer a student in good standing, for reasons the file does not specify. A man named Venya offered to help. She had met him in the circuit of parties and dinners that constituted her social life. He was cheerful and loud, and the kind of man who always knows someone who knows something, the kind who can find a bottle of Armenian cognac at 11 at night, or a mechanic on a Sunday, or, apparently, a place to sleep on short notice. He said he had friends. There was a flat. She could stay a few days while she sorted herself out. This is a normal offer. It was the kind of offer that people make in this city every week, in this period when everything is shifting and nothing is fixed, and the old guarantees are gone, and the new ones have not yet arrived. She said yes. He brought her to an apartment that belonged to a woman named Irina and a man named Igor. They showed her a room. She put down her bag. That evening, Venya came to the room. She understood that this was the price of shelter, and she paid it, and in the morning they sat in the kitchen together and drank tea. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you to hold this image. A kitchen in Moscow, morning light through a window, the sound of a kettle, 4 people around a table. Whatever you think of the people in this kitchen, of the choices that brought them there, whatever judgment you are prepared to render, hold it for a moment. Because what I am about to tell you happened in a kitchen that looked like this, over tea that tasted like this, with the same ordinary morning sounds. Venya, in the looseness of the morning after, the kind of looseness that certain men confuse with honesty, began to talk. He told Galina what they did. He told her about the apartments they had robbed. He told her about a man named Filimonov, a fartsovshik, a black market dealer, the kind of man who trades in foreign goods and foreign currency. He told her how they had questioned Filimonov. He used a household iron. Filimonov had told them everything he knew, and after he told them everything, they killed him anyway. And then Venya was specific about this, careful, perhaps even proud. Each of them in the kitchen had participated in what came next, to bind them all together in the criminal world's concept of shared guilt, so that no one could speak without implicating themselves. Galina held her teacup. Irina was buttering a piece of bread. Igor was looking at something on the table. Then Venya told her about the two girls from the Baltics. He had met them on the street. Two young women who had come to Moscow for a few days, the kind of trip that young people from the Baltic republics made to the capital with increasing freedom in those years. A trip to see the city, to buy things you couldn't buy at home, to be somewhere larger and stranger than where you lived. He had taken them for ice cream at a cafe. He had described certain fashionable boots, the kind that come through unofficial channels, the kind a man who knows people can sometimes obtain. He had put them in a taxi and taken them to a dacha outside the city where a party was already underway. 5 men and these 2 women. They ate and drank and danced. There was music. It must have seemed for a moment like the good version of Moscow, the one that the city occasionally offers before it takes it back. The blonde one said, "It's time for us to go. Thank you for the evening." Venya walked to the door and turned the key in the lock and put the key in his jacket pocket. He said, "What did you think, that we brought you here to dance for free and drink our wine for nothing?" She said, "We could pay for the evening. We have money." He said, "Yes, it's time to pay." He hit her in the stomach. She folded. He hit her in the face from below, a fist coming up, and she fell backward onto the floor, and there was blood from her nose. Her friend, still standing by the locked door, screamed. The other men came quickly. Someone put a hand over the friend's mouth. Someone else tore at her skirt. They were pushed to the floor. By the time it was light outside, the 2 women were thrown out of the dacha. Their money was gone. Their passports were gone. They were told, "If you go to the police, we will find you, wherever you go, and it will be worse." They probably believed it. I know they believed it because the police report was never filed. 2 women from the Baltic republics came to Moscow for a few days and went home changed in a way that had no official record and no name in any document. I have read the sections of the court file where these events are recorded, and I have thought about those 2 women, whom I do not know and will likely never know, and about what it meant for them to go home without their passports, to have to explain at the border where the document was, to construct whatever story would get them through without drawing questions, and about what the days afterward looked like in whatever city they came from, and whether anyone knew, and whether they told anyone, and what it is to carry something with no official weight, no acknowledgement, no record. Galina sat in the kitchen and heard all of this over morning tea. She used a specific word when she described it to the investigator, toshnata, nausea. She said it had arrived before she had finished understanding what she was hearing, the body processing faster than the mind, the way it does when something is fundamentally wrong, and the systems that usually manage our reactions cannot keep pace. She set her teacup down on the table. She looked at Igor. She looked at Irina. She spent the rest of the day in the flat. I do not know why she didn't leave. The investigator didn't know either. He noted it in the file as a question without a confident answer. Perhaps she ran the calculation and determined that leaving in an obvious, panicked way was more dangerous than staying calm. Perhaps she didn't fully believe that her knowing would be treated as a lethal problem. That's a thing that is very difficult to believe even when the evidence is directly in front of you. Perhaps there was nowhere to go that felt far enough. The flat she had shared was gone. The dormitory was gone. The city at night is not kind to a woman with a bag and no destination. That night a man came to her room. His name in the file is Alexander. His nickname, which he had carried for years, was Myosnik, the butcher. The name had come from a picnic, early in his criminal career, when he had caught chickens on a country road and wrung their necks one after another, and people who were present said the thing that they remembered was his eyes, filling with something that one witness described as hatred for everything living, not anger, not cruelty in the usual sense, but a kind of deep objection to the fact of other creatures being alive. The same eyes had been present, witnesses said, when he drove a knife into the dealer Filimonov. He sat on the edge of her bed. He put his hand under the blanket and moved it slowly from her knees upward. She woke and said, "Take your hands off me," he said. "Don't be rough. I'm being gentle about this," she said. "Get out. I want to sleep. I have no time for you." She turned to face the wall. He sat at the edge of the bed for a moment longer. Something moved across his face, something that one of the others, who was watching through the partially open door, described afterward as confusion. He had glanced at her face and thought, "She doesn't look like a prostitute." I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because it was the last thought he had that bore any relationship to her as a person. Then he got up and went back to the kitchen. They sat there for approximately an hour. This is in the file, approximately 1 hour. The lights were on. They poured vodka and drank it in silence, refilling each time, and none of them said much that the later investigation could reconstruct. The hour exists in the file as a gap, a parenthesis between one event and the next. What I know is what everyone in that kitchen knew. She had heard everything, and she would leave in the morning or the day after, and she would eventually tell someone, maybe not the police but someone, a friend, a former acquaintance, a lover, someone who would tell someone else, and the chain would eventually reach a person who would go to the police, and the chain from that point was predictable. They had already killed a man for knowing less. The arithmetic in that kitchen took approximately 1 hour. They went into the room together. Irina stood at the foot of the bed. Igor stood in the middle of the room. Myasnik stood at the head. I will not describe what happened in the room. The file describes it, and the file is a public document, and anyone with access to the right archive can read it. What I will say is that it did not take long, and that when it was over they wrapped what remained and packed it into bags, the large canvas bags of the kind used for laundry or produce, the ordinary Soviet bag of 100 uses. They called a taxi. They drove west across the sleeping city to Tushino. The driver asked no questions. The bags went into the river. The taxi drove back. When they returned to the flat, Venya was there. He had collected her things from the rented apartment, the apartment she had been evicted from, the apartment she had moved out of 2 days earlier. Her belongings were on the kitchen table. They divided them. The file notes, Western branded items, foreign packaging. Whatever she had managed to acquire over her years in Moscow, the small luxury goods that circulate through the informal economy and signify, in their modest way, that someone has navigated the city well enough to obtain them. A jar of something imported, perhaps, something with a label in a language other than Russian. They divided these things quietly, the way you divide the groceries when a housemate moves out, each person taking what they wanted and placing it near themselves on the table. The gang was arrested shortly after. The investigator Kasatkin, the same man who had given me the file, ran the case. Sentences were long. He was not surprised by anything that had happened. He told me, and not because he was a callous man. He said, "This is the logic of the criminal world, and the criminal world has a clear position on women who occupy the margins of its economy. They are either inside the world or they are outside it. There is no position between these two options where a woman is safe. A prostitute of any rank, whether she works the train stations or the hard currency hotel lobbies, will eventually be absorbed into the criminal world or consumed by it. Those are the terms that the criminal world offers," he said. "And the criminal world does not negotiate the terms. There is one more document in the file I want to mention, a statement from the neighbor in the flat below. He was 74 years old, a pensioner, a man who had lived in that building longer than the building had been officially his. He had moved in when the block went up and the allocations were being sorted, and he had simply stayed. He had heard on the night in question the sound of water running at an unusual hour. Footsteps, then a longer silence than the building normally produced at that time of morning. He had not called anyone, he had not knocked. He went to work the next day as he always did, and when he came home there were officers on the landing. He gave his statement calmly, the way pensioners give statements, as though nothing particularly surprising had ever happened in his life. At the end of the statement, the investigator had recorded, verbatim, the single sentence the old man had wanted to say outside the formal questions. He said, "I am sorry I did not knock. I could have knocked, of course. I thought, they can see what they are doing. They are grown people." Kasatkin read me the sentence aloud. He did not comment on it. He closed the file. I asked him whether this was avoidable. He said he didn't know what that word meant in the context of this city, in this decade. He offered me another cigarette and told me that the best investigator he had ever known had resigned and gone into the furniture trade. I spoke to one other man about this case. Not directly about this case, he had not read the file, but about the question behind it, whether what people see in red makes them more likely to do what was done in that apartment in Moscow. He was a scholar, a serious one, a member of international academic bodies, a man whose work I had read and found honest. He said the idea that an adult or a young person reads something or sees something and then immediately goes to repeat it, this is a false picture. It has never been confirmed by any serious research. The men who did this were not inspired by anything in any magazine or newspaper or film. They were men who had already decided over years what other people were worth. The research says nothing changes that conclusion. He was right, and I believe him, and I have not found a way to feel better about being right alongside him. I went back to see Kasatkin a few weeks later to check one detail in the file. It was the same office, the same smell of copying machine solvent, the same chair. He poured different coffee this time. A colleague had brought something from somewhere. I asked him about the two women from the Baltic republics, whether anyone had tried to find them during the investigation, whether their statements had been sought. Kasatkin shook his head once. There were no names. There were no photographs. There was no city of origin. In Venya's confession, they existed as the phrase "two girls from the Baltics," and in the court file they existed in the same phrase, because nothing further had been learned. The investigation had the names and dates and sentences it needed to close the case against the gang. The two women were not witnesses who had been failed to be located. They were an event the gang had described, which the court had recorded, and which procedurally did not require further inquiry to produce a conviction on the charges that mattered. Kasatkin said in the same level voice he used for everything, they remained where they were. They existed and they didn't exist. The file has them both ways. What I believe is also this. Galina came from the suburbs with her examination scores. She passed the exams. She moved into the dormitory. She built a life inside the margins of the city by making a calculation that other people in other cities and other eras have made, an ancient arithmetic of youth and access, and the specific economics of a body in a place where money is scarce and opportunity is narrow. She was good at surviving. She survived for several years. And then a landlord said 2 days, and a man named Venya said, "I can help." And she said yes, because there was no other yes available that morning. I am sitting at my desk now. The city is quiet as it gets, which is not very quiet. There is always the tram on the far street and the coughing in the apartment above mine, the cough that started in October and will not end before April. I have the trial verdict in front of me, 23 pages. It contains the names and the sentences and the procedural conclusions in one line near the end, stated without emphasis, without the language of significance. The victim's belongings were divided among the participants. That is what I keep returning to. Not the hour in the kitchen, not the taxi to Tushino, not the specific horror of what happened in between. The dividing of the things. The Western labels and the foreign packages passing hand to hand over vodka at a kitchen table, quietly in the early morning hours, as if she had always been a transaction, as if that were the sum of what she had been from the beginning, as if her entire time in the city, the examination scores, the dormitory, the calculation and the flat and the years of surviving amounted to a jar of something imported, and a scarf with a foreign label that someone wanted. I don't know what to do with that image. I'll turn off the tape and try to sleep. End of recording.